Imagine this. You're walking through a quiet park on a sunny afternoon when suddenly you see a police officer shove an elderly woman to the ground. The crowd freezes. Nobody dares to help until one man steps forward. Not just any man, Mike Tyson, the legend himself. What happens next will shock you, inspire you, and remind you what true courage really looks like. Blood, shouts, sirens. Those were the three sounds that would come to define that warm summer afternoon in the city park. A day that began with sunshine and laughter, but would soon descend into chaos, fear, and something that looked like pure injustice. The park had been alive with families, joggers, children flying kites, and old friends sitting on benches sharing stories. Parents laughed as their kids raced down the slides. Couples lay on picnic blankets, enjoying sandwiches and iced drinks. It was a kind of day that reminded everyone of peace, of simplicity, of life at its most ordinary and beautiful. And then, into that calm and joyful scene, came an elderly woman. She was frail but carried herself with dignity. Her silver-gray hair shone in the sunlight, moving gently with the breeze. Her steps were slow but steady, each one echoing the weight of her years. She wore a faded gray t-shirt, loose and comfortable, along with worn sneakers that had clearly carried her many miles through life. In her hand, she clutched a small shopping bag, the kind you bring home from a corner store. Perhaps she had bought bread or milk or fruit. To anyone watching, she looked like somebody's grandmother, gentle, harmless, and deserving of nothing but respect. Most people didn't pay much attention to her. She blended into the background of the park, just another face among many. But one person did notice her, and not in a way that would bring kindness. A police officer, patrolling the area, suddenly changed direction and stormed toward her. His face was red with anger, his posture rigid, and his voice already raised before he even reached her. "Hey, you! Stop right there," he barked. Heads turned. Parents froze mid-conversation. Joggers slowed down. A hush fell over the park as everyone's eyes shifted to the scene unfolding in front of them. The woman looked startled. Her tired eyes widened, and she pressed her shopping bag closer to her chest. She didn't run. How could she? She was too old, too fragile. Instead, she took a hesitant step back. I didn't do anything," she murmured, her voice trembling. But the officer didn't listen. He stormed closer, and before anyone could process what was happening, he grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her thin skin. The old woman let out a cry of pain, a sound so raw and helpless that it pierced the heart of everyone who heard it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. "She's just an old lady," another voice muttered. The officer didn't loosen his grip. In fact, he shoved her forward, his strength overwhelming her frail frame. The woman stumbled, her shopping bag falling to ground, apples rolling across the grass. "This isn't right," a man in the crowd muttered under his breath, pulling out his phone. Others began doing the same, raising their cameras shakily, torn between fear and responsibility. The woman pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, I haven't done anything. I'm just going home." But the officer didn't care. He pushed her again, this time harder, and she fell to her knees on the grass. The sight was unbearable, her gray hair now messy, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. She looked up at him, not with anger, but with confusion and fear, as if begging him to stop, as if asking silently, "Why?" The officer loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her up. "Get up," he barked, his voice harsh and merciless. He reached down, grabbed her by the shoulders, and shoved her again, pinning her to the ground. The park went silent except for the struggle. Children stopped playing, their laughter replaced with wide-eyed horror. Parents shielded their kids' eyes. A young man muttered, "This is crazy," but didn't move closer. A woman whispered to her friend, "Should we call someone? Should we help?" Yet nobody dared step forward. The authority of the uniform, the sheer shock of what they were witnessing, it froze everyone in place. The old woman tried to speak through her tears. Please stop. I'm just trying to go home." Her words broke the hearts of those around her, but the officer didn't relent. His knee pressed against her shoulder as he forced her down. His face was twisted in anger, But no one could understand why. She had done nothing. She was defenseless. And yet here she was, treated as if she were a criminal. "This isn't just a scuffle," an onlooker said, their voice trembling. This is brutality." And they were right. The fear in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Some people wanted to help, but felt powerless. Others wanted to shout, but their voices caught in their throats. Everyone was trapped in a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. The old woman whimpered softly, her face pressed against the grass. Tears streaked down her wrinkled cheeks. Her body trembled under the officer's grip. To the crowd, she no longer looked like just a stranger. She looked like their own grandmother, their own mother, someone they loved. And the pain she was enduring was unbearable to watch. Every second dragged like an eternity. People exchanged helpless glances. Should they intervene? What would happen if they did? The tension in the park grew unbearable. A mother clutched her son's hand and whispered, "Don't look, baby." But the boy peeked anyway, his eyes filled with confusion and sadness. The crowd wanted justice, but fear chained them down. The authority of the officer's badge, the threat of consequences, kept everyone at bay. Yet their silence only made the brutality louder. The officer pressed harder, his voice echoing like thunder. "Stay down. Don't move." The woman's weak voice tried once more. I didn't do anything wrong." Her plea hung in the air, fragile and heartbreaking, as the park stood frozen. Nobody knew what would happen next. And then, like a scene straight out of a movie, something shifted. The officer's harsh command still rang out in the air. The old woman's cries echoed the park, and the crowd remained frozen in fear. But from the jogging path, a new presence emerged. At first, nobody noticed. A single figure stepped forward slowly, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. He was tall, broad, and muscular, his arms glistening with sweat from a run. Every muscle in his body rippled with power, sculpted by years of discipline and training. His face, stern and focused, carried an expression that instantly demanded attention. His eyes, dark and sharp, locked onto the chaos unfolding ahead of him. And then the whispers began. "Wait, is that?" "No way, that's Mike Tyson." "Yes, it's him. That's Mike Tyson." The crowd stirred. Phones rose higher in the air. People leaned in, disbelief spreading like wildfire. The man who had just appeared wasn't an ordinary bystander. He was a living legend. The former heavyweight champion of the world, a man whose name struck fear into his opponents, but also carried a legacy of resilience, redemption, and raw power. Mike Tyson, the very same man who once dominated boxing with knockout punches so powerful they ended fights in seconds. The same man whose life story was known worldwide. Struggles, victories, mistakes, comebacks. A man shaped by pain, by survival, by an understanding of what it meant to be broken and yet rise again. And now, here he was, in the middle of a public park, staring down at an act of injustice he could not ignore. At first, Tyson had been on a quiet run, headphones in, enjoying the peace of the day. But when he rounded the corner and saw the scene, a police officer towering over a defenseless elderly woman, pinning her down like a criminal, his instincts roared to life. To Tyson, it wasn't just about what was happening in that moment. It was about everything he had lived through. He had grown up in tough neighborhoods, surrounded by violence and unfair treatment. He had seen people judged and mistreated just because of who they were. And in that instant, it all came flooding back. What he saw wasn't law enforcement. What he saw was abuse. Pure, undeniable abuse. Without a second thought, Tyson changed direction. His run stopped. His focus sharpened. Each step he took toward the officer was slow but heavy, like thunder approaching. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a scene. His very presence was enough to silence the crowd. One by one, the whispers died down. Parents who had shielded their children's eyes now peeked again. The tension, which had felt suffocating, suddenly shifted. There was fear still, but also a glimmer of hope. People sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. The officer noticed the shift too. He glanced up from the old woman, confused by the murmurs and stares. When his eyes landed on Tyson, his body stiffened. For a brief second, The officer hesitated, as if even he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was impossible to ignore him. Mike Tyson wasn't just another man in the park. His physique alone radiated power. His expression, cold, controlled, unshakable, was a kind that made even the bravest opponent think twice. Tyson kept walking until he stood just a few feet away. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but his eyes never left the officer. The crowd could feel the shift in energy. It was as if the balance of power had suddenly tilted. The officer, once so dominating, now looked smaller, weaker, under the shadow of the legend standing before him. Tyson didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The silence he carried with him was louder than any words. Finally, with a voice calm but firm, he broke it. Let her go. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Every person in the park felt it. The officer's jaw tightened. He tried to hold his ground, but the authority in Tyson's tone shook him. "Sir, step back." The officer snapped, trying to maintain control. "This is police business." But Tyson's eyes didn't waver. His voice grew sharper, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "No, that's not police business. That's abuse. She's somebody's grandmother, somebody's mother. You don't treat people like this." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. People who had been silent now found courage in Tyson's presence. They began muttering words of agreement, recording even more closely, their phones catching every angle. The officer's grip on the woman tightened nervously. She whimpered in pain. Tyson's jaw clenched. His fists balled at his sides. It was a familiar pose, one that had once preceded some of the most devastating punches in boxing history. But this wasn't a boxing ring. This wasn't about victory. This was about justice. Tyson took one step closer, and the officer instinctively leaned back. For the first time since the confrontation began, the officer looked uncertain. He had the badge, the uniform, the supposed authority, but Tyson had something far greater. He had the respect of the crowd, the moral weight of justice, and the unshakable courage to stand up for the powerless. People could sense it. Things were about to change. The old woman, still trembling on the ground, looked up at Tyson through teary eyes. In her gaze was a mix of fear, relief, and disbelief. She didn't know who he was. Maybe she didn't follow boxing. Maybe she didn't recognize the legend. But she knew this. A protector had arrived, and the crowd knew it too. From that moment, the story was no longer about an officer and an old woman. It was about something much bigger. It was about Mike Tyson stepping in when no one else dared to. The park, once silent with fear, now buzzed with anticipation. The atmosphere was electric, almost cinematic. People leaned forward, holding their breath, their cameras steady. They knew history was unfolding before their eyes. Tyson stood tall, unshakable, his presence filling the park like a storm ready to break. And though he hadn't thrown a single punch, he had already changed everything. Everyone knew. The moment Mike Tyson arrived, the fight was no longer one-sided. Everyone knew. Things were about to change. The officer's grip tightened on the old woman's frail arm, his knuckles white with force. She whimpered, her weak voice barely escaping her lips. And then, suddenly, he felt it. A shadow. It stretched across the grass, swallowing him whole. Heavy, dark, commanding. Slowly, the officer turned his head, and when his eyes landed on the figure towering over him, his jaw went slack. His confidence faltered for the first time. Standing just a few feet away was Mike Tyson. His muscles were tense, carved like stone, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. His expression wasn't one of anger. It was worse. It was calm, deadly serious. His eyes locked on the officer like a predator studying prey, and in that gaze was a warning. You've already gone too far. Tyson's voice came low, calm, but with a weight that could crush stone. Let her go. Now. The words cut through the silence of the park. Every person watching felt them, like a vibration in the air. Parents held their children tighter. Phones zoomed in closer. The crowd leaned forward, the tension thick enough to choke on. The officer straightened his shoulders, trying to puff up his authority, though his hands trembled slightly on the woman's arm. "Stay back, sir," he barked, his voice cracking at the edges. This is official police business. But Tyson didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His presence alone was enough to make even the boldest man hesitate. His fists hung loosely at his sides, but the veins of his arms pulsed with restrained fury. "That's no business," Tyson growled, his voice growing louder, sharper. "That's abuse. She's somebody's mother. Somebody's grandmother. You don't treat people like this." Gasps spread through the crowd. People raised their phones higher, recording every second, whispering to each other. "He's right. Oh my God, Tyson's actually stepping in. This cop's done for." The officer's eyes darted nervously to cameras, realizing the entire park was watching, that this wasn't a private act anymore. Every second he held on to the old woman was another second of shame being immortalized on dozens of phones. But his pride, his uniform, his fear of losing control, it made him stubborn. He clenched his jaw and refused to release her. The old woman let out a faint cry. "Please, it hurts." That sound broke something inside Tyson. His fists clenched tight, the muscles in his forearms twitching with the instinct to strike. His body vibrated with barely contained power, the kind of power that ended fights in seconds, the kind of power that had once terrified entire arenas. But this wasn't the ring. This wasn't sport. This was about justice. "Listen to me," Tyson said again, his voice rising now like rolling thunder. His eyes narrowed, his entire body shifting forward, closer to the officer. "If you hurt her one more time," he paused, letting the silence hang, his stare drilling through the man's soul, "you'll regret it." The park went deathly still. Children who had been whispering fell silent. Parents stopped shifting. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The officer swallowed hard, sweat starting to form on his forehead. For the first time, he truly looked at the man before him, not as a civilian, not as a bystander, but as Mike Tyson. The name alone carried a legacy of fear, of ferocity. Tyson wasn't just another man. He was a fighter who had stared down giants, who had lived through wars both inside and outside the ring. And right now, every ounce of that history stood against him. The officer tried to summon his authority again, but his words came out weaker this time. "Step aside. This doesn't concern you." But his voice cracked, and everyone heard it. The crowd muttered louder now. Some shouted, "Let her go." "He's right. Do the right thing." The energy in the air shifted. What had once been fear was now momentum. The crowd's courage grew, feeding off Tyson's presence. Each cheer, each shout, was like fuel pouring into the confrontation. The officer looked around, dozens of cameras pointed at him, dozens of voices condemning him, and standing right in front of him, one of the most intimidating men alive. Still, pride clung to him like armor. He yanked the old woman closer, making her stumble. She gasped in pain. That was the breaking point. Tyson's stance changed. He stepped forward, shoulders squared, his towering frame casting an even larger shadow over the officer. His fists unclenched, then clenched again, the veins in his temples pulsing. His voice dropped, low and dangerous, the kind of voice that made every hair on your arm stand up. "I'm only going to say this one last time," he warned. "Let her go." The old woman sobbed softly, looking up at Tyson with pleading eyes. The crowd's noise grew into a wave, chants and shouts mixing together. "Let her go. Stop this. Do the right thing." The officer's confidence wavered. His grip loosened ever so slightly, but his pride still chained him. He opened his mouth as if to argue again, but the words died in his throat, because Tyson took one final step, closing the distance between them until they were almost face to face. The tension was unbearable. Every single person in that park knew one wrong move could ignite a storm. Tyson wasn't just threatening. He was promising. His body screamed with restrained violence. But his discipline held him back, balancing on the razor's edge between peace and chaos. The air was thick. The confrontation had reached its peak. Everyone knew one decision, one action, would decide what happened next. The officer's grip had been cruel from the start, but then, without warning, he shoved the old woman with a force so vicious it almost knocked her unconscious. The gasp from the crowd was deafening. Mothers screamed. Children cried out. The old woman stumbled, her fragile body collapsing under the weight of the shove. Her shopping bag spilled again, oranges rolling across the grass. She clutched her chest as if the very breath had been driven out of her. And that was it. Mike Tyson had been holding back, his fists trembling with restraint, his fury bottled up behind discipline. But in that instant, the line was crossed. The lion within him awoke. Tyson stepped forward, no hesitation, no doubt, just pure, protective instinct. His presence expanded like a storm crashing down. He wasn't just walking. He was charging, like a lion protecting its cub. The earth itself seemed to shake under the weight of his determination. The officer, startled but still arrogant, raised his hand, palm out, as if to push Tyson away. "Back off," he barked, his voice desperate, cracking under the pressure. But Tyson wasn't just any man. He wasn't a bystander, and he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. With the kind of speed that had once ended fights in seconds, Tyson's arm shot out like lightning. In a blur, he caught the officer's wrist midair. The crowd gasped at the sheer precision. Tyson's grip was like steel, unbreakable, unyielding. With one swift motion, he twisted the wrist backward, locking it in a painful hold. The officer's eyes went wide. His mouth fell open in shock. A sharp cry of pain escaped him as his knees buckled. The power he had wielded over the old woman evaporated in an instant. The elderly woman stumbled free, her body trembling, her breathing shallow. She staggered toward the crowd, and immediately a young man in a hoodie rushed forward, catching her before she collapsed. He held her gently, whispering, "You're safe now, ma'am. You're safe." The crowd erupted. Cheers burst forth like a dam breaking. "Go, Mike." "Thank you, Tyson." "Save her." "Justice." The energy was electric, unstoppable. People clapped, shouted, and some even cried. What had once been a scene of fear had transformed into a moment of triumph. The officer squirmed in Tyson's grip, tried to pull away. His free hand clawed at Tyson's arm, but it was useless. Tyson's strength was overwhelming, a force of nature he could never hope to match. But here was the most shocking part. Tyson didn't strike him. He didn't throw a punch, didn't lash out, didn't unleash the legendary power that had once terrified men in the ring. No! He simply restrained him, using his strength with precision and control. Because this wasn't about violence. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Tyson leaned closer, his voice low, rumbling, deadly calm. "Look at me," he growled. "You think you're strong because you push around an old woman? That's not strength. That's weakness. You don't get to hurt people just because you wear a badge. Not today. Not ever." The officer's face twisted in pain and humiliation. The crowd's camera zoomed in, capturing every second, broadcasting his defeat to the world. Tyson's grip held firm, unshakable. He kept the officer bent low, his arm locked in a position that rendered him powerless. The crowd could see it clearly now. The balance of power had shifted. The old woman, trembling but safe, lifted her head to look back at her savior. Her lips trembled as she whispered softly, "Thank you, thank you." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they weren't just from fear. They were from relief. The people in the park were no longer passive spectators. They were alive, engaged, emboldened. Voices rose in unison, chants forming from the chaos. Justice, justice, justice. The officer's face turned red with embarrassment. His authority, once absolute, had crumbled under the weight of truth and courage. His power was gone, not just because of Tyson's grip, but because of the eyes of the crowd, the phones recording, the truth spreading like wildfire. For the first time since the confrontation began, the officer looked uncertain, small, even. Tyson stood tall, unwavering, his muscles taut, but his control absolute. He didn't want to destroy. He wanted to teach. His every action sent a message. True strength wasn't about domination. It was about protection. The officer stopped struggling, his eyes darting to the crowd, to the cameras, to the dozens of people shouting at him. His breath came fast, his pride collapsing under the unbearable weight of humiliation. And then, in that single frozen moment, the image became clear. A frail old woman rescued, a crowd united, and Mike Tyson, a living legend standing against injustice. The park thundered with cheers. Tyson released the officer's wrist, shoving him back with just enough force to make him stumble but not fall. The message was clear. The fight was over. The abuser had been stopped. Tyson turned, his body softening as he looked at the old woman being comforted by bystanders. His eyes softened too, his voice gentle this time. "You're safe now, ma'am. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The woman nodded weakly, her tears glistening in the sunlight. Behind them, the officer stood frozen, rubbing his wrist, his face pale with shame. He looked around, but the crowd's eyes burned into him. No one respected him now. No one feared him. His power had been stripped away, and all that remained was his guilt, his exposure. The crowd's chants grew louder. "Go Mike! Hero! Legend!" And in that moment, the truth was undeniable. The turning point had come. What began as a scene of cruelty and fear had been transformed by the courage of one man, a man who refused to stay silent, a man whose name carried power, but whose heart carried even more. Mike Tyson had stood up, and the world had shifted. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the chaos of the park. Within moments, more police cars screeched to a stop along the edge of the grass, doors swinging open as additional officers rushed out. Their radios crackled with urgent voices, their footsteps heavy as they approached. But the scene they walked into wasn't what they expected. By then, everything had already changed. The elderly woman was no longer on the ground. She was standing, supported gently by two bystanders, her frail arms resting on their shoulders, her face pale but safe. The officer who had brutalized her stood several feet away, clutching his twisted wrist, his face burning with humiliation as hundreds of eyes stared him down. And at the center of it all stood Mike Tyson. His broad shoulders were squared, his expression calm but firm, his presence commanding the space like a guardian protecting his people. The crowd stood behind him, their phones raised high, recording, documenting, making sure the truth could never be erased. The arriving officers slowed as they approached, unsure of what they were stepping into. They saw the cameras. They saw the crowd chanting Tyson's name. They saw the shame etched into the face of their fellow officer. And most importantly, they saw the woman, trembling but alive, her tears a living testimony of what had just happened. In that moment, they knew the power dynamic had shifted. The abusive officer wasn't in control anymore. The people were. And the man who had made it happen wasn't wearing a badge or uniform. He was wearing sweat-soaked running gear, his fists clenched not to fight, but to protect. He was Mike Tyson. Within minutes, videos began flooding social media. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire. The old woman crying out in pain, the officer's cruel grip, the crowd's silence turning into chants, and finally, the decisive moment when Tyson stepped in. His words, his strength, his sheer refusal to let injustice stand. It all became a digital storm that swept across the internet. Headlines appeared within hours. Mike Tyson saves elderly woman from police brutality. From the ring to real life, Tyson becomes a hero in public park. When strength means standing up, Tyson protects grandmother from abuse. Millions watched, commented, and shared. Across the globe, people praise his courage. Tyson trended on every platform, not for fighting the ring, but for a fight in real life, the kind of fight that truly mattered. Later, when reporters surrounded him, shoving microphones forward, Tyson didn't boast. He didn't make it about himself. His voice was steady, his words simple, but they carried the weight of truth. No one should ever stand by and watch an innocent person suffer, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd of journalists. If you see wrong, you stop it. Doesn't matter who you are, or who they are. That's humanity. Those words hit harder than any punch he had ever thrown. They weren't about fame or legacy or proving anything. They were about principle. They were about what it means to be human. The old woman, still shaken but safe, later spoke through tears. Her voice cracked with emotion as she recalled the moment. He was like a guardian angel, she whispered. I thought no one would help me. I thought I was alone. But then he came. He saved me. Her words touched hearts everywhere. People who had once only known Tyson as a fierce fighter now saw him as something greater. Not just a champion in boxing, but a champion of people. And so, what had begun as a terrifying scene of injustice transformed into a story of hope because of one man. One man who refused to stay silent. One man who remembered what it felt like to be powerless and decided no one else should feel that way. One man who proved that strength isn't measured in knockouts or belts, but in courage, compassion, and the willingness to stand tall when it matters most. That man was Mike Tyson. As the sun set over the park that day, families who had once stood frozen in fear now left with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Children who had once cried now spoke with excitement. I saw Mike Tyson. He saved that lady. Parents nodded, grateful their kids had witnessed not just a legend, but an act of real heroism. And for the millions who watched online, who shared the story, who felt the goosebumps rise as they replayed the moment, there was one lesson etched into their minds. True greatness doesn't come from fame or fortune or titles. True greatness comes from standing up when it matters. In Park, Mike Tyson showed the world what true greatness is.